September 2 years ago, my wife Carrie and I received a phone call that we would never forget. We'd been married for about a year and a half and had reached that point that a lot of young couples reach where you're like, well, we've got the marriage, the job, things are lining up. Let's start building our family. Let's start trying to get pregnant. So we did. We started trying, and it kind of wasn't happening, and we were starting to get a little worried. And let me just take a step back before I go any further. I'm Chris. I work in Kids Club for Crossroads. Yeah, sure, great. Thanks, Mom. My wife Carrie and I met in April of 2011 at the Children's Theater of Cincinnati. We were in a production of Peter Pan. I played Peter, she played Wendy. So we're officially that couple. Showmance led to romance. We got married. And Carrie now works at Children's Hospital. She's a math teacher for kids who have cancer and blood diseases. And I work in Kids Club. And you've probably noticed a theme here in our professional lives. Children's Theater, Children's Hospital, Kids Club, kids, children, kids, children. We love what we get to do. We get to work with kids, and it's great. And so we thought, well, who better than us to be parents, right? We got this. And it just wasn't happening. It wasn't happening. And this is what you do in the modern world when something like this starts to happen for you. You go to Google, and you just empty your anxieties. Like, why is this happening? What if this is going on? And so you start trying different things. You time things a certain way. You eat certain things. You don't do certain things. And we're doing all that, and it still wasn't working. So the next step in, like, the flow chart is that Carrie went in for some fertility testing, and she's completely fine. Totally checked out, full marks, good job. And so I went in for what I thought would be a pretty routine sperm count, and that leads us to September of 2 years ago. My name is Chris, and I have a low sperm count. How low? Low. To give you an idea of what would be considered typical or normal, it's such a big number that you just kind of throw a big number up there. You just say like, oh, that's 100 million. Yeah, like 200 million sperm if you're normal, right? It's like how many people have ever seen Star Wars ever? I don't know, like 500 million, right? There's no number, you just guess. Well, if you had that much, you'd be normal. If you had about 6 million, doctors would be like, ooh, that's kind of weird. Wonder what happened there. If you had 600,000, that would be considered abysmally, dangerously low. So imagine our surprise to get the result of 6. Hear me, not 6,000, not 6 million, 6, which is specific. That's weird. I'm not supposed to actually know. And it was surprising. I went through like a whole, honestly, I went through a whole grieving process of like denial, anger, and it just didn't make sense. Why us? We took that question to God. God, why us, of all people? Why is this our story? This doesn't make sense. This isn't the story that we would have picked or the story we wanted or what we planned. It felt humiliating and pretty frustrating. And it reminded me of this moment in Jurassic Park. I love movies. Where it's about halfway through the movie, dinosaurs have started eating people, it's awesome. And the guy who founded the park, John Hammond, he is sitting eating ice cream in the middle of the night for some reason, I don't remember why. And then Dr. Sattler is sitting down with him, and they're talking about what's going on. And he keeps saying things like, when we get the power back up, we get the system back up, when we have control again. And Dr. Sattler cuts him off. It's a great line in the movie. She says, you never had control. That's the illusion, and it's gone now. And that's a great moment in a movie. But when it's your life, man, and you realize, oh, I thought I was in control, but I'm not. I had the illusion, and now I don't even have the illusion of being in control. It's gone now. That sucks. That's hard. But you say, well, what are my options? We looked into a couple of different things. We looked into something called IUI. It's also known as the turkey baster method. For obvious reasons. Because of my low count, it would basically be a waste of time and money, so that slammed in our face. So we looked into something else called in vitro fertilization, IVF. That's a little more common. Infertility, or in my case, subfertility, which is so much better. Infertility affects about 1 in every 8 couples, so IVF is a little bit more common now. we looked into it, and the way IVF works is you jack the female up on hormones with daily injections so that she overproduces eggs in her next ovulation cycle. Maybe she drops 20 eggs. It's real, it's a thing, you can look it up, all right? So let's say she drops 20 eggs. Then you take sperm from the dad, and you put them in each test tube, and you try to fertilize each one. You swirl them around in like a whirligig kind of thing. Science happens, and then maybe of those 20, maybe only 10 get fertilized, and of those 10 that are fertilized, maybe only 5 are what's called viable, meaning that they've started to multiply. And of those 5, maybe you freeze 4 of them for future use, because you can do that these days. And you take 1 or you take 2 embryos, you place them in the mother's uterus, and you wait. Well, for us, because of my low count, do the math. If Carrie were to drop 20 eggs, I got 6. So we'd have to do something called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where you take a very fine needle and you take sperm one by one and you inject them into each egg. It's a little bit riskier, and in our case, it's a little bit less likely to work, and it costs more. To give you an idea of the scale of these kinds of expenses, it would be like going to buy a brand new Lexus and you're not guaranteed the Lexus. Yeah. So we said, God, why us again? Are these the alternatives here? And you may think, well, what about adoption? What about foster care? Hey, if you're a parent, you have the best job in the world. I believe that to my core. And if you're an adopting parent or a fostering parent, even more so for you. But if you're going through that, you know that you don't enter into that unless you're called and equipped to the task. And it's a little embarrassing for me to admit because I'm part of Kids Club, but we're not called and we're not equipped. So God, are we childless, but we work with kids for some ironic reason? Or do we enter into an uncertain medical situation that leaves us in debt forever? Is that our 2 options? We didn't know what to do. Until one day, my mother-in-law, and doesn't this always come from your mother-in-law? But she told us about this thing that she came across online called embryo adoption. And we said what everybody we've talked to since then has said, embryo adoption? What's that? Never heard of that. Well, embryo adoption, I believe, is a beautiful way to build a family. It's been around for 20 years. It's like over 500 kids have been brought into the world this way. We'd never heard of it. Why? Because infertility, such as it is the kind of thing that you just don't talk about. We don't talk about this. But my mother-in-law came across this website for a group called Snowflakes, which is part of Nightlight Christian Adoptions. They're a legit organization. And we took one step looking into Snowflakes, and a door opened. Honestly, the door that opened to us was that they were nice to us and they didn't say no. So we looked into it. And it's not like all the doors opened up at once. Because here's the thing. This is how embryo adoption works. Let's say that you were that hypothetical IVF couple from before. You've got 5 viable embryos. You try transferring 1 or 2, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But at the end, you're like, I'm all done. We're done building our family. What do you do with the other embryos? What do you do? And this is where politics and our story kind of intermingle because, and I don't want to go into the politics, but if you don't believe that embryos are people, it's easy. You can have them discarded as medical waste or sold for research like stem cell stuff. But if you believe, and Carrie and I happen to believe, that life begins at the moment of conception, regardless of the method it took to get there, then those embryos are kids, and they're waiting for someone to give birth to them. And couples like Carrie and me, if somebody donates them, we can get matched and we can adopt those embryos. It's mind-blowing, right? And I'm happy to tell you that in January of this year, Carrie and I adopted 14 embryos from out of state. It was really exciting. They arrived in Cincinnati in this little R2-D2 looking thing, like still frozen. And here's the crazy thing about this. These embryos were made in April of 2011. That's when they were frozen, which you were paying attention earlier. That's when we were in Peter Pan. So that feels to us like from the moment we became a couple, God was like, I got your kids covered. Yeah. And in May of this year, we transferred 2 of them. We had 2 of the 14 thawed and transferred into Carrie's uterus, and we started to wait. And they told us, don't take home pregnancy tests, but we ignored them, and we took home pregnancy tests. And we had 5 in a row that were positive, and then we went in for some routine blood work, and we found out we weren't pregnant anymore. It's called a chemical pregnancy or an early-term miscarriage. And we felt so sad and so stupid. and so back at square one. God, why is this our story? Why did we go through all of this? Oh, that's right. We're still not in control. He is. Once again, we got the illusion of control, but once again, it's gone. It's not in our power to do this. And if you're going through something where it feels like you're just not in control of something that you feel like you should be in control of, I just want to let you know there are three things that are okay for you. One, it's okay for you to feel however you feel. Do not let a social media #obsessed, I'm happy, clappy, everything's perfect in my life culture tell you how to feel. Don't let the success or progress of someone your same age tell you how to feel. You're allowed to feel how you feel. Feelings aren't good or bad. They're just feelings. They come and they go, and you're allowed to feel them. Two, it's okay to talk about this. Men especially, we don't talk about anything that makes us seem vulnerable or less than a man. But I'm telling you, whenever I've spoken about this, the people I talk to, they don't always react the way I want them to react. But there's always more strength and freedom on the other side of talking about it. Talk about this. It's important. We were hanging out with some friends, Jim and Chelsea. They're really close to us. They've got 2 kids and 1 more on the way. And one night we were just bemoaning, like, why are we going through this? We can't wait to be parents. And Chelsea looked us in the eye, I'll never forget this night, and she said, are you kidding me? You're parents already. You already are parents. Do you have a little person who lives in your house and shares your last name and relies on you for survival yet? No. But it's part of who you are, your parents. And I'll never forget that. Talk about it. Now, there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways to express it. If you want some guidance around that, there's a podcast called IVFML. It's awesome. You got to check it out. And finally, the third thing is it's okay to take a step. If you're at that point of surrender where you're like, God, clearly I'm not in control like you are, so please open a door, and he's opened something to you, take a step. It's okay. That's what Carrie and I have decided to do. After a lot of soul searching and counting the cost again. This fall, we're trying again. We're going to do another transfer in the fall. And why? Why again? Why is this our story? Because we're parents.
Good morning, 10 o'clock. How are we doing? All right. Hey, I just have to say, I'm so excited to be a part of a community where we are having the undivided conversation. So I want to encourage you to jump in and be a part of that in the fall. And also, just as a friend and someone that gets to work with Chris Stewart, can we just give it up one more time for his honest, bold, powerful story? So it's Chris's story and stories like it that really have inspired me to talk about what I want to talk about for the rest of our time. I just know that on any given Sunday in this room, people are going through difficult things. Any given Sunday in this room, there might be people who have just had divorce papers served on them or just have a bad diagnosis they've just received. There's a variety of things, and we might be in the middle of a story that very much is unresolved. And it's because of those stories, because of you, and because of fiercely honest emails I received like this one that I want to talk about this today. An email I received from a woman that says this: in the last 2.5 years, I have worked through and conquered a good number of things, but I hadn't dealt with my feelings about God or how God felt about me during the last 9 years of suffering. This woman is in the middle of a very, very difficult period of suffering in her life. The months and months that I cried out for God's presence and he withheld it from me. Regardless of how hard I sought him, I felt nothing but utter silence. My world completely fell apart in that silence. The pain of that silence, the feeling of complete abandonment, this is what echoes deep sometimes when I hear stories of miracles, when people pray for God's presence and he shows up in tangible ways. Not everyone was healed by Jesus, and it's not always because of disbelief. What does living in that reality really look like? I'm not even sure I know, but I can't seem to let go of the prompting to ask. And after I received this email, I couldn't let go of the prompting to talk about that, to give a voice to people who may be in that place. And as I've been thinking about this, for some reason, this is the image that keeps coming to my mind. This is a flight recorder, or it's the black box. So if you've ever heard of a plane crashing, really in the same breath or the next breath, you'll hear the reporter say whether or not they found the black box. And that's such an important human question because we believe if we find the black box, we'll know why this plane fell from the sky. So everybody really wants to know that answer. And I think if you're in a difficult place, if you're in the midst of suffering right now, you are searching for the black box. Nothing raises more questions about God, about ourselves, about the world that we live in than suffering. Questions like, why is this happening to me? We heard that echoed in Chris and Carrie's story. God, why is this our story, they asked. Questions like, where is God in the middle of this difficult situation that I'm in? Or how am I supposed to deal with this? I was talking to my friend Kathy, who leads the grief group here in Oakley, and she lost her husband to cancer some years ago. And she said of grief that grief doesn't necessarily end in resolution, but it can end in transformation. She said that grief will change you for better or for worse. And I think there's truth to that. And so how do we lean in and allow the grieving process or the loss or the suffering that we have to be transformative in our lives, to change us for the better? I read a book recently in preparation for this week called Option B. That's where I get the title from, Option B. It's by Sheryl Sandberg, and if that name sounds familiar, it may be because she's the COO of Facebook. She also wrote a book called Lean In, which is really about empowering women in the marketplace. But a couple years ago, she lost her husband suddenly while they were on vacation. So they had been on vacation, they were playing a game. He left to use the treadmill, and after a couple hours, no one had heard from him, and they went into the exercise facility, and they found him face down next to the treadmill, dead of a heart attack. And a few weeks into this journey for her, one of her children had a father-daughter activity, and she just cried to a friend, I just want Dave here. I want Dave here. And her friend looked her in the eye and said, hey, option A is not available, so let's kick the SHIT out of option B. And the story that she writes is really her story of learning how to recover from that loss. And she says this in the story, in the book. We plant seeds of resilience in the ways we process negative events. After spending decades studying how people deal with setbacks, psychologist Martin Seligman found that 3 Ps can stunt recovery. Number 1, personalization, the belief that we are at fault. Number 2, pervasiveness, the belief that an event will affect all areas of our life. And number 3, permanence, the belief that the aftershocks of the event will last forever. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite pictures in my office. It has 2 of my favorite dudes on it. And the one on the blue is the one I want to talk about a little bit. It's my dad, Charles. And I love that picture, and as I look at that picture now, it hurts a little bit to look at that picture, and that is because over the last 2 weeks, my dad has had 2 strokes. And he's had strokes now for a period of years, and last year he had a stroke that really accelerated dementia in his life. And if you've ever experienced that with someone, the tough thing about dementia is you really don't lose that person all of a sudden. You kind of lose them piece by piece along the way. And so I've just been reflecting on the reality that I don't know how much longer my father is going to be here. And even now, as I interact with him, there are things about him that are different. And it's a difficult place to be. And I don't know what you want when suffering comes. I don't know the questions that you ask. I wonder if you just want it to go away. And if it doesn't, I wonder what kinds of questions you ask to God, about God. You know, we sing songs around here all the time like, you're a good, good father, but aren't fathers supposed to fix things and make them right? So how do we wrestle with God and our relationship with him when things aren't going right or when we actually do face loss? One of the things the Bible says about Jesus is that he is the exact image of God. That if we want to know what God is like, we can look to Jesus. We can see the character of God in Jesus. We can see how God responds to the reality of our human existence. And that's why I love that the New Testament is full of stories about Jesus in real life situations, including situations where people are suffering loss. And so today, I want us all to step into a story that for some of us may be familiar, for others of us may not be, but it's a story of Jesus in the midst of suffering friends who have experienced loss. This story takes place in Bethany, a small village right outside of Jerusalem, where Jesus had very close friends, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, who lived there. And we're going to pick up the story in John chapter 11, verse 17, after Lazarus has died. It says this, "Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" And I want us to just pause at that point. Think about this woman. This woman who believes that Jesus is the Son of God, has seen him do powerful things. And she looks at him and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Is she angry in that moment? Does she feel sullen, depressed? Is she a little bit awkward about expressing the deep disappointment she has in her friend Jesus? But yet she expresses that grief to him. How do you feel as you think about that? The story goes on, "But even now," she says, "I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Here's Mary, Lazarus' other sister, expressing the same anguish, the same disappointment, the same frustration to Jesus. How do you think Jesus received this? How do you think he felt as he saw his friends experiencing loss? Well, the story goes on to say, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then we get two of the most powerful words probably ever spoken about God in any of the writings of the Bible. It says, Jesus wept. Look at Jesus in this story as he sheds tears, as his friends are experiencing the difficult realities of this broken world. What do you see? What do you feel as you observe him? Could it be that in this moment, Jesus feels exactly what we do when we suffer? There were observers who saw this scene, and there was really a divided response. And this goes on to say, the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" So we see this divided reaction where some people look at the tears of Jesus and say, what compassion he has for his friends. But others look at his tears and say, but why couldn't he have come sooner and prevented this from happening altogether? And so here's my question. Who do you most resemble in this story when you're facing difficulty? Or if you're there right now, who do you most resemble? Is it Mary and Martha, who though they may believe in Jesus, they express this frustration around Jesus, if you had just shown up, my brother would not have died? Do you identify with the people who see his tears and say, man, this is a broken world, but look at how he loves, even in the middle of this broken world? Or are you on the other camp of people who look at Jesus' tears and say, but if he really loved this family, why didn't he show up sooner for them? I've been looking at this story differently, considering difficulty in my own life and also just the difficulty that I know is going on in many of your lives. And when I do, I just can't get past these two words, Jesus wept. I just can't get past it. And I want us to understand, this was mind-blowing to hear these words about divinity. It was mind-blowing in this time. So John, who wrote this book, was writing to a Greek audience, an audience whose worldview of God was primarily shaped by the gods of the Greek mythology, the pantheon, the thing we all learned about in high school, right? And the characteristic of those gods that was most predominant was they were absolutely apathetic toward humanity. They would use humans, they would curse humans, but they didn't care about humans. They were apathetic. So for John to say that Jesus, who is in fact divine, who is God in the flesh, weeps at the loss and pain of his friends, it was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing. And I want us to see here that God enters into the black box of suffering with us. He doesn't avoid sorrow, and he doesn't avoid grief. And so if you're in that place, you can learn some things about the character of God in the middle of your unresolved story by looking at Jesus in this story. 3 things in particular. First, Jesus' tears shatter the lie of personalization. Remember those 3 P's? This is the one, the belief that it's my fault. And yet what we see in this story is Jesus sheds tears at the brokenness of this world. So it is not all your fault if you're in the middle of suffering. This world is broken, and because of that, we all suffer. But if God is willing to enter into your pain and suffer with you, that means that you're not alone. It's not just you. You haven't been singled out. And in fact, in the midst of your suffering, the presence of God is still there. You know, we share a lot of stories on video here. We tell stories all the time. And a lot of those stories have a resolution. People have gone through difficult, crazy things in our community and have experienced hope on the other side of it, have experienced even miracles on the other side of that. And I know sometimes if you are listening to those stories, watching those stories, and you're in the middle of an unresolved story, you might feel like your story doesn't belong. And I want you to know you belong here and your story belongs here. You belong here. The reason that we have thousands of people in healing groups is because there's a lot of people in our community with stories that are not yet resolved. The reason that we get hundreds of prayer requests every week is because there are hundreds of stories that are not yet resolved. The reason that we have a volunteer prayer team at every site that prays for people as they stay in their seat after services is because those services are filled with people whose stories are not resolved. I want you to know very clearly you belong here and your story belongs here. And Jesus' tears shatter the lie that this is somehow only your fault. Number 2, Jesus' presence shatters the fear of pervasiveness. This is the belief that it's happening in every area of my life. You know, what strikes me in this story is how Jesus responds to Mary and Martha when they say those powerful words. I mean, it could be that Mary and Martha might be the most clear-headed, honest people in all the Bible. Seriously, because they believe Jesus is the Son of God. We hear Martha express that. They believe in even a resurrection that is yet to come, that there is hope even beyond this life. And yet, in their honesty and in the fullness of their emotions, on this side of that good news, they say, Jesus, if you had only come, my brother would not have died. But what moves me about this is, do you notice Jesus is simply present with them? He simply receives that from them. He allows them to feel what they feel. It's like what Chris said. It's okay to feel what you feel. Jesus says that to his friends. It's okay to feel what you feel. He doesn't reprimand them. He encourages Martha, but he doesn't reprimand them. He doesn't get indignant because they don't know who they're talking to. No. He is with them. His presence is there. And that shatters the lie of pervasiveness, because if his presence is there, then good is there. If his presence is there, then hope is there. If his presence is there, then comfort is there. So there's these verses in the Bible that don't make much sense if you've not gone through anything difficult. But if you've gone through difficulty, they make all the sense in the world. Verses that say that the God of all comfort comforts us so that we can comfort others with the comfort that we received. Or words that we find in the Old Testament book of Psalms that say God collects our tears and places them in a bottle, that he remembers every one of them. Or Jesus' words to his disciples in just a few days from this experience, when he would say to them as he faces the cross the next day, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. Or what Jesus says to every follower, I will never leave you, neither will I forsake you. Even in the midst of our worst pain, the presence of God is there. It may be clouded. It may not be as clear, but the presence of God is there. We did a series on Psalms some months ago. And in Psalm 23:4, it puts it this way: even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. It doesn't mean you get to avoid the valley, but it does mean you don't have to travel through the valley alone. A friend of mine put it really well. He said, when we are in the middle of an unresolved pain or story, we feel like we've lost everything, but we have never lost everything if God is with us. So Jesus' tears shatter the lie of personalization, and his presence shatters the fear of pervasiveness. And finally, Jesus' actions shatter the hopelessness of permanence, the belief that it's always going to be this way. Jesus in this story goes on to do something incredibly powerful. He actually goes to where they've laid Lazarus. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. He has them remove the stone, and Jesus speaks to the grave and says, Lazarus, come forth. And the dead man rises again. It's an unbelievable story, unbelievable power being displayed here. And yet I know what you're thinking, because I think the same thing when I think about loss in my life. That didn't happen for my spouse. That didn't happen for my brother, my sister. That didn't happen for my kid. And this is where I want us to understand what Jesus is demonstrating here. He did not raise Lazarus from the dead to be the norm. Lazarus died again, but he raised Lazarus from the dead in this moment to be a sign. To be a sign that a day will come when there will be no more tears. A day will come when the final enemy of death, as the Bible calls it, will be defeated. There will be a day when we get new bodies. There will be a resurrection that everyone who has followed Jesus will experience, and we will have hope beyond hope forever. It's why one of my favorite verses in the Bible is at the very end of the Bible, Revelation 21:5. This is Jesus seated on the throne, and it says this: He who was seated on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. You know, my dad, I don't know if my dad has 20 days left or 20 years left. I don't know that. But I tell you what I do know. I know that my dad knows, loves, and follows Jesus. And so here's what I know. I know that at some point, my dad's mind that is giving way to him right now, that mind that is deteriorating, I know that one day when my dad dies, he's going to wake up in the presence of Jesus and have a mind that works perfectly. That works perfectly and will work perfectly. And I know that this body that is failing him now and the frailty that I see that is so hard to look at for a man that I saw as Superman as a kid, but I know that one day when Jesus returns and my dad gets a new body, I will be with him and I will see my dad in a body that functions perfectly. And that is my hope, even on this side of that. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to shed a ton of tears. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to go to Jesus and say, Jesus, you could have healed my dad. We could have had more years with my dad. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean that his death isn't the end of the story. And it also means his death doesn't have to be the end of my story. Your loss doesn't have to be the end of your story. In the book Option B, these researchers have done all this research on people who have experienced loss. And as you might imagine, there's a high level of people who experience loss and experience PTSD. They experience some traumatic distress based on that. But they continued to follow those people, and what they found is over time, those same people also get to a place of what they call post-traumatic growth. Here's what they say. Post-traumatic growth could take 5 different forms: finding personal strength, gaining appreciation, forming deeper relationships, discovering more meaning in life, and seeing new possibilities. Remember that email that I read at the beginning? Fiercely honest, in the middle of the struggle. Well, this is what she also writes in the middle of the struggle that she's still in. And I know that God eventually rescued me. The freedom that I have now is so much more precious because of the deep captivity I have experienced. I have come to know God in a deeper way from his absence. But truthfully, this journey led me to a place where I am reconciling with God, where I have embraced the idea of his presence even in those profound silences and the wounds that come along with that. Jesus tells Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And I believe that those words have a truth on multiple meanings. That one meaning, yes, absolutely, a day will come when all will be made right. But it also means that right now, in the middle of your suffering, in the middle of your grief, it may not lead to resolution. But as Kathy said, it can lead to transformation. So what? What do we do with all of this? Well, my first application is actually for people who aren't suffering, but are friends or family members of people who are. And I think we can learn from Jesus' example in this story. Do you notice how Jesus is high on presence in this story, but sparse on words? I think there's a learning there for us. Because I know from people who have grieved that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do as a friend that's trying to come alongside and support is just simply sit next to them and be with them. And if you're in the middle of an unresolved story, if you're in the middle of something difficult right now, I want you to know God is the God of option B. God is present in option B. It may not be the life that you wanted. It may not be the thing that you thought was going to happen, but it does not mean that you are away from God. I will not pretend that everything will be okay. I will not pretend that that wound won't always have an aspect of who you are or be an aspect of who you are, but I will tell you, you do not have to travel through it alone. Jesus is present in our suffering, and he's present in the middle of our pain. And whether we hear him or not, or see him or not, we have this example in Scripture, I believe, to give us faith, to believe in what we can't see, because that's what faith really is. So we're going to take communion as we close today. And that might seem like a huge left turn from what we've been talking about, but it isn't. There's a verse in Hebrews 2 that says, "For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." What does that mean? It means that Jesus was made more perfect. He was made more able to connect and identify with us because he identified with the human experience of suffering. It goes on to say, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. You know, communion is really remembering the love of God for us. That's why we do this regularly. So I'm going to invite all the folks who are serving communion to take their stations. We'll have stations all across the front here. We'll also have stations in the back. On the balconies, and I think even in the second balcony we have stations back there. If not, you can come down and be a part of a station on the first balcony. But in light of what we read in Hebrews and in light of Jesus in this story, what if Jesus' death on the cross wasn't only to atone for our sins, which is the beautiful gospel that it was, that Jesus sacrificed himself and he died in our place. That is a beautiful thing. But what if that wasn't the only reason that he suffered the way that he did, but that he also suffered not just to save us, but to identify with us, to identify with our pain, to identify with physical pain, to identify with relational pain as he hung on that cross, separated from his Father, so that he could be a merciful and faithful high priest, a God who is present in option B. So as we take communion today, if you have said yes to following Jesus and you are in relationship with him, then we do this regularly as a way to remember his love for us, as I said. Maybe you've not said yes to following Jesus. If you haven't said yes to following Jesus, it is okay to not do this. In fact, I would encourage you not to do this. This is a very intimate thing for people who have said, Jesus, you're my life, and I trust you. So maybe just being in this environment is a great way for you to see, man, this is what it looks like. This is one of the expressions of that. But I also know that perhaps you're going through something so difficult that you've gotten to a point where you say, you know what, I need life. And if Jesus is offering me life, I'll take it. And man, if that's you, then I want to encourage you to take communion today as your first communion, as an act of receiving what Jesus has for you. I know that there are some people in here who are in the middle of a very unresolved story. And so as we take communion today, after everyone else has left, I want to encourage you to return to your seat. And we have our prayer team here, and they would love to pray with you. Sometimes the way that we experience God's love is we experience it through a human being. I call it love with skin on. And so if that's what you need today, I want to encourage you to pray, to stay and receive that prayer. Let's all pray now. God, I just ask that you would meet all of us where we are, and particularly those of us who are in a really hard place. God, I pray that this communion experience wouldn't be a ritual. That as they come and get the bread and dip it into either the grape juice or the wine, I just pray that it wouldn't be ritual, but that we would understand what this reflects. That it reflects your love for us. And God, for people in this room who are hurting, I pray that they would experience your love in a profoundly personal way today and in the days to come. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. We can all stand and take communion together.